The Betrayal. How Bernie Sanders was silenced by the DNC. It was the primary season of 2016. Across the United States, millions of voters flooded into arenas, town halls, and polling stations. They weren't rallying for a dynasty. They weren't cheering for the establishment. They were there for a man who had spent decades in the political wilderness, a man who had refused corporate donations, a man who was speaking to the frustrations of working Americans. His name was Bernie Sanders. But Bernie Sanders never had a real chance. The Democratic Party never intended for him to win, because the fix was already in. Sanders had ignited something the Democratic National Committee had never seen before, a mass movement driven by small-dollar donations, an insurgent campaign that threatened the status quo. His ideas were bold universal healthcare, free college tuition, and breaking up Wall Street banks. He promised to dismantle the power structures that had controlled American politics for generations, and that is why he had to be stopped. Because for the Democratic National Committee, for the Clinton machine, and for the billionaires bankrolling both, Bernie Sanders was more than just a candidate. He was a threat. The rigged system. The Democratic National Committee is supposed to be neutral during the primaries. It is supposed to let the voters decide, but in 2016, the DNC was not neutral. Internal emails later published by WikiLeaks revealed that top officials in the party were actively working against Bernie Sanders from the start. They strategized ways to undermine his campaign. They questioned his religious beliefs to hurt him in conservative states. They colluded with the media to shape narratives that painted him as unelectable. They coordinated debate schedules in ways to minimize his exposure to voters. The DNC had chosen its candidate before the race even began. The name was Clinton. The plan was coronation. Hillary Clinton was the candidate of Wall Street, the favorite of the financial elite, the one the establishment had spent decades cultivating. Her backers included some of the most powerful financial institutions in the world: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, BlackRock, the Carlyle Group. They had invested in her because she had delivered for them before. As a senator, she supported banking deregulation. As Secretary of State, she protected corporate interests abroad. And now, as the DNC's chosen nominee, she was their safest bet to keep the system intact. The last thing they wanted was a Sanders presidency. A Sanders presidency meant an end to their power. The superdelegate shield. The DNC had more than just inside influence. It had a weapon. Superdelegates. Superdelegates were high-ranking party officials, former politicians, and lobbyists who controlled an outsized share of the nomination process. Unlike normal delegates, they were not bound to the will of the voters. They could choose whomever they wanted. And they chose Clinton. Before a single vote was cast, before the primaries had even begun, hundreds of superdelegates had already pledged to her. It was a firewall, a safeguard, a way to ensure that no matter how many people turned out for Sanders, no matter how much momentum he built, Clinton would always have the advantage. The media collusion. The establishment didn't just control the party, they controlled the narrative. The DNC worked hand in hand with major news networks, CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, to shape how voters saw the race. Debate moderators were briefed to push Clinton-friendly talking points. Polls were manipulated by oversampling Clinton-leaning demographics. Reporters were given pre-approved questions to ask Sanders. Again and again, voters were told Sanders had no chance. Again and again, they were told Clinton was the inevitable nominee. But the people weren't buying it. Sanders was drawing crowds in the tens of thousands. He was winning key states. He was surging in donations. The establishment saw this, and they panicked. So they changed the rules. The final betrayal, the 2016 DNC convention. When the convention arrived, it was no longer a primary race. It was a scripted event. The results were already decided. Sanders delegates were shut out of key votes. The convention schedule was manipulated to favor Clinton's optics. Protesters were removed from the convention floor. It wasn't just a betrayal of Sanders, it was a betrayal of every voter who had believed the system was fair. But the story didn't end there. The price of the fix. They rigged the primary to defeat Bernie Sanders, and then they lost the general election to Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton had been sold to the American people as the safe candidate, the one who was electable, the one who was inevitable. but millions of voters saw through it. The working class voters Sanders had energized, many of them stayed at home. Some even voted for Trump, believing, rightly or wrongly, that he was the only outsider left standing. The Wall Street donors had secured their candidate, but they couldn't buy the will of the people. What it means today: the betrayal of Bernie Sanders was not just about one man. It was about what happens when money controls democracy. The DNC silenced a movement. It destroyed trust in the system. And in the end, it handed the White House to a man it claimed to fear the most. Now, the question remains: have they learned their lesson, or is history doomed to repeat itself?